I had kept the old Sun Temple at Aldermost for 31 years before the morning they brought me the Runt, and in all that time I had never once thought of myself as the keeper of anything but mess. The temple was a ruin when I came to it, and it was a ruin still, though a greener one. Folk built it 3 lives ago to catch the morning, a great round hall with a dome of fitted stone, and somewhere in the years between then and me, the dome had split clean across like an egg knocked too hard. By the time I climbed the hill with my one bag and my bad knee, daylight came down through that crack in a long bright bar that moved across the floor with the sun, and rain came down through it too, and the floor that was meant for praying on had gone to soil. Vines had found the cracks. A fig had got its roots into the altar stone and shouldered it sideways. There was moss on the fallen pillars thick as a sleeping cat, and in the spring the whole broken hall went loud with bees. I never could decide whether the place was holy or only stubborn. I have come to think there is less difference between those two things than a younger man would tell you. I did not set out to make it a refuge. I set out to have somewhere quiet to be old in. But a man who feeds himself in a green place soon finds he is feeding others, and a man who patches his own roof soon finds he is patching the nests under it. And one thing leans into the next until you look up one day, and there is a 3-legged marsh hound asleep in your boots, and a brood of orphaned wingcats in the rafters, and a blind old pack beast you keep on past all sense because he knows the sound of your step. The town below called the place the greenhouse when they were being kind, and the heap when they were not, and they sent me their dying things the way you send a letter you do not want to write. A creature too lame to sell, too sick to eat, too strange to look at, somebody would haul it up the hill in a sack and leave it inside the broken doors and go back down without knocking, and in the morning I would find it, and that would be that. I did not mind. I have never been good with people, and I have always been good with the things people throw away. It is a smaller talent than healing. I want to be honest about that from the start. I did not heal much. Mostly I kept things warm and fed and out of the wind while they decided whether to live, and I sat with the ones that decided not to. There are worse ways to spend an old age. I cannot now think of a better one. So when the cull wagon came up the hill that morning, I thought it was only the usual sad freight, and I went out to meet it the way I went out to meet all of them, with a bucket in one hand and no particular feeling in my chest. It was the cull season. I should say what that was, for it matters to the rest. Twice a year the frontier holdings drove their stock through a sorting, and whatever did not make the count, the lame, the small, the wrong-colored, the slow, went into the wagon and down to the rendering yard. And that was the law and the sense of the place, and I had long since stopped arguing with it. The man who ran the sorting that season was named Brannock, a heavy, careful man with a tally book and a way of looking at a living thing as if it were a sum that had not come out right. He was not cruel. I want to be fair to him, too. He did what the holdings paid him to do, and he did it without temper, which in some men is a worse thing than cruelty, though I could not have told you why at the time. Brannock climbed down off the wagon board and stood with his thumbs in his belt, and looked at my green ruin the way town men always did, like it might be catching. "Got one for you," he said, "if you want it, otherwise it goes in with the rest." "What is it?" I said. "Drake whelp," he said it flat. The holdings kept a few breeding drakes for the heavy hauling, big patient brutes, slate and bronze, good for a sledge in deep snow. The eggs that came strong were worth a year's wage. The eggs that came wrong were worth nothing and were dealt with quietly and were not spoken of. "Came out of a good clutch," Brannock said, "but it came out wrong. Runt. And the color's off it. No good for work, no good for sale. The breeder didn't even want the trouble of it. Said put it down with the lambs." He scratched under his jaw. "I would have. Only the thing won't quit, and I've a soft spot, more fool me, and I thought of your heap." "Show me," I said. He went round the back of the wagon and lifted out a grain sack with something in the bottom of it, and he set the sack down on my doorstone and folded back the mouth of it, and the morning came down through the crack in the dome and fell on what was inside, and I will tell you plainly that I stood there a long moment and did not breathe. She was the size of a half-grown dog and no bigger, when she should have been the size of a yearling calf, and she was the wrong color the way fresh snow is the wrong color against mud. The work drakes were dark, slate over bronze, dull as old iron. This one was white. Not pale, not faded white, true white, ivory laid over a faint warm pink where the scale was thin at the throat and the soft webbing of the wings. Her scales were small and overlapping and very fine, more like a fish's than the plated armor the big drakes wore, and the light came through the edge of them so that she seemed to hold a low private glow even out there on the cold steppe. She had the shape of her kind plain enough, the long neck, the wedge of a head, the four legs folded wrong under her, the claws curled, the tail looped tight around herself for warmth, the two small wings half spread and shivering. She was a dragon. There was no mistaking the line of her for anything else. But she was a dragon the way the first thin frost is winter, a small wrong-made beginning of a great thing. And her eyes were the worst of it and the thing I could not look away from. They were pink-rimmed and pale all through, the pink of the inside of a shell, and they did not find me. They moved. They opened and turned and searched, but they searched the empty air a foot to the left of where I stood, and then a foot to the right, and they never once came to rest on my face. She could not see me. She could hardly, I think, see the day. The color that was wrong in her had taken her eyes along with everything else. She made a sound. It was small and rough and rose at the end like a question, and it is the sound I have heard most in my life since and will hear, I expect, at the end of it. I did not know yet that it was a word. I thought it was only a sick thing crying. I know better now. "There," said Brannock, not unkindly. "You see, no good to anyone. The breed's no use blind, and the color frightens the other stock besides. They won't pen near it. Best thing for it is quick." He looked at me sidelong. "But you've a name for keeping the no-goods, so yours, if you want the bother. I'll mark it culled on the book either way, makes no odds to me." I crouched down. My knee complained, and I let it. I held out my hand, not toward her face where she could not see it, but low and to the side, into the cold air where her searching eyes kept going, and I waited. It took her a while. She was frightened and she was cold, and the world for her was a dark thing full of hands that grabbed and sacks that closed. But she smelled me, I suppose, or felt the warmth coming off my palm, and after a long moment she stretched out her wedge of a head on her thin neck and touched her nose to the side of my hand, very lightly, the way a creature checks a thing it cannot see and is not sure it can trust. Her nose was cold. Her breath, when it came, was warm, and there was the faintest catch of smoke in it, the merest ghost of the fire her kind carried, banked down to almost nothing in a body too small to hold it. She pushed her head into my hand. That was all. She pushed her head into my hand and held it there and let out a long breath, and the rough little sound she made dropped down out of its question into something lower and steadier, and I felt the shiver in her ease just a fraction. And that was the whole of it. That was the entire moment on which all the rest of my life turned. An old man's cold hand and a blind white head pushed into it on a doorstone in the morning light. "I'll take her," I said. Brannock grunted, marked his book, climbed back up onto the wagon board and drove the dead and the dying down the hill and left me with the live one. I carried her inside out of the wind, into the green hall where the bar of sun lay long across the floor, and I made her a bed of clean straw in the warm angle where the altar stone leaned, where the south light pooled all morning, and I set down a dish of broth and a dish of water, and I sat back on my heels to see what she would do. She would not eat at first. She lay where I had set her with her wings tight and her tail looped and her blind eyes open, and every little while she lifted her head and turned it and searched the air and made that rising sound, and got no answer, and laid her head back down. I understood that she was calling. For her mother, I thought, or for whatever warmth she had last known before the sack. I did not try to gather her up and hush her. A creature that has been grabbed all its short life does not want to be grabbed kindly. Instead, I did the thing I had learned to do over 30 years, which was simply to stay. I sat on the cold floor a little way off, near enough that she would smell me and hear me breathe, far enough that I was not a hand reaching for her, and I talked. I told her nothing of any worth. I told her about the fig that had broken the altar, and the bees that would come in the spring, and the marsh hound asleep in my boots by the door, and the way the bar of sun would move across her through the morning and warm her if she had the sense to follow it. I told her she was safe, which she could not understand, in a voice that perhaps she could. I am not a praying man, but I have come to think that talking gently to a frightened thing in a ruined temple is as near to prayer as I will get, and that it is not so far off as the town would say. She ate near midnight. I had nearly fallen asleep against the altar stone when I heard the small wet sounds of it, and I did not move and did not look, only let her be. And in the morning the dish was empty, and she had dragged herself the length of one wing into the warm pool of straw and was breathing slow and deep, and the smoke in her breath had a little more body to it than it had on the step. I have brought a great many creatures back from the cold edge of things in my life, and I will tell you it never once stopped being the finest thing I knew, that first deep, easy breath. But I had never felt it the way I felt it that morning, kneeling in the long light with my heart going like a young man's over a blind white runt that the whole world had measured and found worth nothing. I called her Wisp. It was not a grand name, and she was not then a grand thing. She was a wisp of a creature, all pale and faint and like to blow out, and the name fit her the way an old coat fits, by being there when nothing better offered. I have heard since that she was owed a far greater name, and that the name I gave her was a small foolish human thing to hang on what she was, perhaps, but she came to it. When I called Wisp across the green hall, her head would lift and turn, and her blind eyes would search toward my voice, and she would come, scrambling, her weak wings half out for balance, her claws skidding on the old stone, and that is more than most grand names ever earn. A name is only the sound a thing answers to. She answered to Wisp. I will not be ashamed of it. That was the autumn. I should tell you about the winter, because the winter was the long middle of it, the part the town never saw and would not have believed, and it is the part I would keep if I could keep only one. She was blind, or near enough that the difference did not matter, and so the first thing I learned was that I would have to build her a world she could find without her eyes, and the second thing I learned was that she was cleverer than any creature I had kept and would help me build it. I hung small bells. A bell at the water dish, a bell at the door to the warm room, a bell on the old rope by the altar where her bed was, each with its own voice, and within a fortnight she had them by heart. I would hear her cross the hall in the dark of a winter morning, claws ticking on stone, and stop, and tilt her head, and find the right bell by ear, and I never once after that had to lead her to her water. I laid scent down the paths I wanted her to keep, a streak of crushed mint along the safe edge of the broken floor, a streak of tar by the drop where the cellar stair had fallen in, and she learned mint for go and tar for stop the way a child learns hot and cold, by getting it wrong once and right ever after. I patted the fallen pillars she liked to climb. I cleared the floor of every loose stone that could turn an ankle. I made the ruin, which had taken 30 years to grow wild, into a thing a blind young dragon could run flat out through in the dark without fear, and the first time she did it, the first time she came tearing the length of the hall toward my voice with her wings out and her head high and no hesitation in her at all, trusting the world I had laid down for her. I had to sit down on the altar stone and put my hand over my mouth, and I was glad there was no one to see. Her wings would never carry her. I knew that before the first snow. They were soft and small, and the bones in them had come in wrong with the rest of her, and however she stretched and beat them she would not lift, and there was no fixing it, not by me and not by anyone, and I did not try. But I did not bind them down out of the way either, the way a tidy man might, to spare her the trying. I let her try. There is a thing I believe about broken creatures, and it is the only thing I believe firmly enough to call a creed, and it is this, that the dignity of a living thing is in the reaching, not in the having, and that you do a creature a deeper harm by taking away its reach than by letting it fail at it. So I let her beat those useless soft wings against the winter mornings until she was tired, and then I warmed her, and in the spring she beat them stronger though no higher. And I have thought since that perhaps that was the first small kindness I did her that mattered, more than the broth or the bells. That I did not decide for her that she could not, but only stood by while she found her own edges and stayed inside them with her. She talked. I have said I did not know at first that her cries were words, and that is true, but I learned it over the winter, the way you learn the speech of any creature you live close to, by living close to it. The big workdrakes did not talk, or if they did no one had ever bothered to listen. But Wisp talked, low in her chest, a rough warm rising and falling that I came in time to understand was not the dumb noise of an animal but the early shape of language, simple and direct and strange, the speech of a young mind feeling for the world it could not see. She named me. Not with a sound a man could make, but with a sound that meant me, that meant the warm step and the low voice and the hand that came low and to the side. And when she made it across the dark hall, it landed in my chest the way my own mother's voice once had. And I am an old man and not a soft one, and I will not pretend otherwise. The town did not understand any of it and did not try. Word got down the hill that the old heap-keeper had taken in a blind white drake run, and was wasting good winter feed on a thing the holdings had already written off, and the town did with that what towns do. They laughed, in the easy way of men who have decided a thing in advance. I heard it when I came down for salt and oil. I heard it from boys who were too young to have earned an opinion, and from old men who should have outgrown the need for one. Feeding a corpse, they called it. Said I'd gone soft in the ruin, said the cold had got into my head, said the runt was bad luck and the wrong color, and would bring the winter down hard for keeping it past its time. Brannock, when I met him at the salt house, did not laugh, but he looked at me with that careful some not coming out look and said, not unkindly, "You know it's no use, Edon. You're a sensible man. You know there's no work in it and no sale in it and no end to it but the one you're putting off." And I said I knew. And he said then why, and I found I did not have an answer for him that he would understand, so I gave him the only one I had, which was that the thing was alive and had pushed its head into my hand, and he shook his head and let me be. I do not blame him. By every measure the town and the holdings had, he was right and I was a fool. They had the measures. I only had the morning and the warm breath and the head pushed into my hand. I have come to think those are also a measure and not the smallest one, but I could not have made the case at the salt house, and I did not try. There was a market day I think of. I had brought her down in the cart basket, wrapped warm against my chest, because she was young still, and a young thing left alone all day grows fearful, and because I wanted her out in the world a little even if the world was only the muddy square below the hill. The town gathered the way a town does. A man I had known 40 years stood off and said, loud enough to be meant, that the wrong color in a beast brings the wrong weather, and that the winter was hard for my keeping the thing past its time, and that I would answer to the holdings for it when the spring count came up short. A boy at his elbow, learning, picked up a frozen clod and threw it, and it struck the basket and broke, and Wisp went rigid against me, her head down, her wings clamped, the way she went when the world turned to grabbing hands. I did not raise my voice. I have never found that raising it improved a man who had decided to be small. I only stood there in the mud with my hand over the basket, over the small clamped body, and I let the square go quiet around me, and when it was quiet I said to the man, plainly, that I had buried more living things than he had ever fed, and that I knew the difference between a beast that was going out and a beast that was only waiting to be let live, and that this one was the second kind, and that he could take it up with the holdings or with me or with the spring as he liked, but that he would not take it up with her. Then I bought my salt and my oil, and I carried her back up the hill, and part way up, where the path turned and the town dropped out of sight below us, I felt her ease against my chest, and she made the low steady sound into my coat, and I understood she had heard all of it, the clod and the cold words and the answer both, and that she had been listening, the way the blind listen, when the rest of us are only looking. It was deep in the winter, the hard black middle of it, that I first saw the watcher. I had gone out at dusk to bring in the last of the wood, and the snow lay blue, and the cold was the kind that stops your breath. And I looked up out of habit toward the tree line that ran along the ridge above the temple, and there was something standing in the gap between the pines that had not been there before and was not a pine. It was white. That was what caught me, a white shape against the snow, which should have been no shape at all, except that the snow was the blue-gray of dusk, and the shape was the clean white of fresh fall, and the difference between them was just enough to see. It was large. Larger than the work drakes, larger than anything that had business on that ridge, long-necked and still, and it was turned toward the temple, toward the broken dome where the low light of my fire would be showing through the crack, and it did not move, and after a moment I understood that it was watching, and that it had perhaps been watching some while. I am not a fearful man, but I knew enough of the world to feel the cold go a degree colder. A white dragon, full grown, standing on my ridge in the dead of winter, watching my fire. I went very still myself. We stood like that, the watcher and I, across a quarter-mile of blue snow, long enough that the wood grew heavy in my arms. And then it turned, unhurried, enormous, a slow swing of that pale, long neck, and stepped back into the dark between the pines and was gone, and the ridge was only a ridge again. I went inside and barred the door, which was a foolish thing to do against a creature that could have taken the dome off the temple with one pull, and I sat by the fire with Wisp warm against my leg and my heart going hard, and I told myself I had seen a trick of the dusk. But I had not. I knew I had not. And in the morning I went up to the tree line in the new light and found, pressed into the snow in the gap between the pines, the print of a great clawed foot, 4 toes and the drag of a tail behind, far too large for any work-drake, and around the print the snow was melted in a wide, clean ring, the way snow melts under a thing that carries fire in it. I stood a long time looking at that print. Then I went back down to the temple and did not tell anyone, because there was no one to tell who would not have said I had gone soft in the ruin, and because I did not yet understand what I was looking at, and because, I will be honest, because some old animal part of me had begun to wonder, looking from that great melted print to the small white runt asleep in her straw, and I was not ready to let the wonder finish its thought. The watcher came again, not every night, but I learned to feel it, the way you learn to feel weather coming in a bad knee, a particular stillness on the ridge, and when I felt it I would go out and there it would be, the white shape between the pines turned toward the broken dome, watching. It never came down. It never came close. It only watched, night after winter night, that great pale patient presence on my ridge, and in time I stopped being afraid of it, the way you stop being afraid of a thing that has had 1,000 chances to harm you and taken none. I came to think of it almost as a neighbor, a strange, cold, high neighbor, keeping its own counsel. I did not tell Wisp. I do not know to this day how much she knew. Sometimes, on the nights the watcher came, she would lift her head from the straw and turn it toward the ridge, her blind eyes searching, and make a low sound I had not heard her make before, a long rising note. And from the ridge, I swear this is true, though I cannot prove it and would not try, from the ridge, very faint, very far, something would answer her. And then she would lay her head back down and breathe slow, easier than before, as if a thing she had been listening for all her short life had finally said one word back. There was a night, before the night she asked me, when I thought I would lose her, and it belongs here, so I will set it down. The cold came in waves that winter, and the worst of them came in the black middle, a still hard cold that cracked the stones and froze the water in the dish overnight, and somewhere in the worst of it Wisp took a sickness. I knew it before I saw it, the way you know with a creature you have lived close to. She did not come to the bells in the morning. I found her in the straw with her sides going fast and shallow, and the smoke gone out of her breath entirely, so that when I held my hand to her muzzle there was only cold air, and her small body, that had been warm against my leg every night of the season, was the temperature of the floor. A drake that loses its fire is a drake that is going out, and there is no medicine for it that I ever found, only warmth and time and staying, and so I did the only thing I had, which was all 3. I built the fire up past sense, until the green vines along the wall steamed. I wrapped her in every blanket I owned and then in my own coat, and I held her against my chest where my own heat was, the whole of that long black night, and I talked. I told her the same nothings I had told her the first night on the floor, the fig, the bees, the bar of sun that would come if she waited for it, and I felt the cold in her, and I was afraid, and I am not often afraid. Near the dead middle of the night, when her breath had gone so thin I had to put my ear to her to be sure of it, the watcher came down off the ridge. I did not go out to it that time, but I heard it, the great careful weight of it moving in the snow outside the broken doors, closer than it had ever come, near enough that I felt the doorstone take its tread, and I heard it make, low and long, the deep ringing tone, the one I would come to know in the thaw, and Wisp, who had not lifted her head in hours, lifted it. She lifted her head against my chest and turned it toward the door and answered, the barest thread of sound, and out in the killing cold, the great thing answered her back, patient, steady, again and again through the worst hours, as if it were breathing for her, as if it had come down off its ridge to lend her its fire across the snow because she had none of her own left. By the gray of morning the smoke had come back into her breath. By noon she ate. The watcher was gone, and the snow by the doorstone was melted in a wide, clean ring, and I knelt in it a long time and did not say anything to anyone, because there was no one to tell, and because I had begun, that night, to understand a little of what I was holding. It was on one of those nights, late in the winter, that she asked me. She had grown over the season, not to her right size. She would never come to that, but stronger, her chest deeper, the smoke in her breath a steady, warm thing now and not a ghost. She had been beating her wings at the cold all evening, the useless soft wings, beating them and beating them against the dark and getting no lift, and at last she had stopped, and come and laid herself down with her head in my lap by the fire, and I had been stroking the fine scale between her eyes the way she liked, when she made a sound I had not heard before, low and careful, and I felt her go still under my hand, listening for the answer the way she always did. And I understood somehow that this was a thing she had built up the courage to ask, and that she meant it for me. I had got good by then at her speech. I will not pretend I had it all, but I had the shape of this. She asked me slow, in that rough, warm, rising chest voice, feeling for each piece of it, she asked me whether she was worth the keeping. I do not know how she had the words for it. I have thought about it a great deal since, and I think she had heard the town. I think on the days I carried her down the hill in the cart basket for the salt and the oil, wrapped warm against my chest, I think she had heard the laughing and the wrong color and the feeding a corpse, and had understood more of it than I knew, the way the blind understand more than the seeing give them credit for, because they are listening when the rest of us are only looking. I think she had lain awake in the straw on the watcher's nights, turning it over in her young dark mind, the breeder who would not have the trouble of her, the wagon, the sack, the man who said put it down with the lambs, the whole great weight of every measure the world had taken of her and found her wanting. And I think she had decided to ask the one creature who had not put her down whether he too, in the end, was only putting it off, whether she was, when all the sums were done, worth the keeping. I will tell you what I did. I did not say yes quickly, the way you reassure a child, because she was not a child and she would have heard the quickness and known it for the kindness it was and not the truth. I sat with it. I let the fire crack. I put both my old hands on either side of her wedge of a head, on the fine warm ivory scale, and I turned her face up toward mine though she could not see it, so that my voice would come to her straight, and I said it as plain and slow as she had asked it. I said, I have kept dying things for 31 years, and I have buried most of them, because most of what the world throws away is throwing itself away too, and there is no shame in that and no fixing it. I said, I have never once in those years fed a thing I did not think was worth the feeding, because I am old and I am poor and I cannot afford to be foolish, whatever the town says. I said, you are blind and small and you will never fly, and you are the wrong color for the work they wanted you for, and every one of those things is true, and not one of them is what you are worth. I said, A creature's worth is not in what it can haul or what it can sell or what color it comes out. I said, I have watched you cross this whole broken hall in the dark with no fear in you because you trusted the world I laid down. I said, I have heard you answer something on the ridge that I will never hear. I said, you are the best thing that has come up this hill in 31 years, and I would feed you if it took the last of the wood and the last of the oil and the last of me, and I would call that the soundest thing I ever spent. And then, because all of that was true but none of it was the whole of it, I said the small plain thing underneath it, the thing she had really asked. I said, yes, you are worth the keeping. You were worth it on the doorstone, and you are worth it now, and you will be worth it when I am gone, and I am sorry the world told you otherwise, and the world was wrong. She was very still under my hands while I said it. And when I was done, she pushed her head up into my chest, hard, the way she had pushed it into my hand that first cold morning, and she made the lower sound, the steady one, the one that was not a question, and I felt the last of some old held-tight thing go out of her. And she slept, and I sat there with her warm weight against me and the fire going down and did not move for fear of waking her, until the gray came up through the crack in the dome. That was the deepest part of the winter, and the night I would keep above all the others, and I have told it slow because it deserves slow. Now I will tell the rest quicker, because the rest is the part the town came to know, and the part that gets told and retold down there with my name worn off it, and I want to set down once how it truly went before the telling wears it down to nothing. The thaw came late and hard, and on the third morning of the thaw, with the snow running off the ridge in gray ribbons and the first bees stunned and stumbling in the new sun, the Ivory court came up the hill to my ruin. I heard them before I saw them, and what I heard was the town. A great rising noise came up from below, not the noise of a fire or a fight, but a stranger thing, a hush spreading where there is usually clamor, the sound of a whole town going to its knees, and under it a deeper sound, a low resonance I felt in the soles of my feet before I heard it in my ears, the sound of very large creatures moving together with great care. I went out through the broken doors with Wisp pressing close against my leg, her head up, her blind eyes searching, and I stood on the doorstone where I had stood that first morning, and I watched them come. They came up the hill in the full light of the thaw, and they were white, all of them, white as Wisp was white, ivory laid over warm pink at the thin places, their fine scales taking the morning the way hers did, so that the whole company seemed to carry its own low glow up out of the gray running snow. They were enormous. The watcher I had seen on the ridge all winter walked among them and was the smallest of them. They were not the slate-hand bronze brutes of the holdings. They were a different and a greater kind, long and deep-chested and grave, their wings folded high like sails furled, their movements slow and exact and full of a terrible gentleness, the gentleness of strength that has nothing left to prove. And at the head of them came one who could only have been their first and oldest, a matriarch white going to faint gold at the crown and the wing edge with great age, her eyes, and this struck me through, this above all, her eyes were pale and pink-crimmed, and they did not quite find me where I stood. She was old. And she was, I understood in that moment with a lurch of the heart, going the way Wisp had been born. The ivory blood, in its great age and its great rarity, carried that pale blindness as its birthright and its burden. What the holdings had culled as a defect was the very mark of the highest blood there was. They stopped a little way off, in a wide grave half-circle, and the matriarch came on alone, slow, her long neck low, until she stood close enough that her breath, smoke-warm and vast, moved my hair, and she lowered her great pale head down and down until it was nearly level with mine, and she looked at me with her blind old eyes that did not find my face, and then she turned that head a fraction and found, the way the blind find, the small white shape pressed against my leg. Wisp had gone very still. And then she made the sound, the long rising note, the one she had sent up to the ridge all winter, and the matriarch answered it, close, full, a deep ringing tone that I felt in my chest and my teeth and the broken stones of the temple, and Wisp answered that, And the two of them stood there in the running light, speaking to one another in the speech of their blood, while I stood between them holding my breath, the smallest and the greatest of the ivory line. And I understood that I had been keeping a lost princess of a sacred house in a heap of straw, and calling her a wisp. I will not pretend I knew, then, the whole of what they told me, for they told me in a way that was only partly words. But I have pieced it together since, from the one among them who learned to speak with me in the days that followed, the watcher from the ridge, who turned out to be the matriarch's own grandson and the searcher of the line. This was the shape of it. A clutch of the ivory blood is a rare and guarded thing, born seldom, scattered for safety across the holdings in the old custom, so that no enemy might take a whole generation at one stroke, given over as eggs to the work-drake breeders, who do not know what they are minding, to be watched from afar and gathered when grown. But the world is wide and the holdings are careless, and an egg goes astray. And this one had gone astray into a sorting and been judged by men who saw only a runt and a wrong color, and had been one morning and one mark in a tally book away from the rendering yard. The searcher had been hunting her the whole of the autumn and the winter, ridge to ridge across the frontier, following the thinnest thread of her, and had found her at last in the green ruin of a sun temple, warm and fed and named, asleep in clean straw, taught to run without fear through a world an old man had laid down soft for her in the dark. He had stood on my ridge all winter, the searcher told me, not because he doubted, but because he could not at first believe it. Because his kind had given the lost daughter of their line up for dead, mourned her, said the rites over an empty place, and here she was, kept alive past all reason and all profit by a creature at the very bottom of every hierarchy there was, a thing his people had no name for and no place for in their reckoning, a human, poor and old and alone, who had nothing to gain by her, and had fed her anyway from the last of his wood. The matriarch raised her head from wisp and turned it back to me, and the whole grave white company behind her went still as the temple stone, and she spoke to me. She had no human words, but the searcher gave me her meaning after, and her meaning was this. She did not thank me. I have thought about that, and I am glad of it. Thanks would have been a small thing, and she did not deal in small things. She did not offer me gold, or land, or a place at any court, though I learned later she could have given me a kingdom and thought it cheap. She said, and I give it as the searcher gave it to me, she said that her line measured worth as men measure it, by blood and by strength and by the height of a wing, and that by that measure they had weighed the lost daughter and the keeper both, and found the daughter wanting and the keeper beneath counting, and that they had been wrong in the same way and by the same blindness as the men of the holdings, and that the wrongness shamed them more, because they were old enough to have known better. She said that I had kept the truest measure there was, the one her people had forgotten in their long greatness, that a living thing is worth the keeping for its own sake, and that the dignity of it is in the reach and not the having, and that I had kept it not as a teaching but as a plain daily habit in the dark, for no reward, when it cost me. She said that this was the oldest law of the ivory blood, written before they could fly, and that they had let it gutter out, and that an old human in a ruin had kept it burning for them without knowing he held their fire. And then she did the thing that the town tells wrong, and that I want to set down right. She did not kneel to me, and her company did not kneel, and I am glad, because I would not have known where to put myself, and because kneeling is for kings and I have never been one and would make a poor show of it. What she did was lower her great pale head slowly, until her brow touched the doorstone before me, where Wisp had first pushed her nose into my hand, and she held it there a moment. The oldest and the greatest of the ivory line bowed down to a stone in a ruined doorway, and then she rose, and gave me the daughter's true name, a long ringing thing I cannot make with my mouth and will not try to spell. That meant, the searcher told me, the one who was kept. She who was found worth keeping, and she gave me a name in return, for the keeping, a name of their tongue I also cannot spell, that the searcher rendered for me as nearest as our speech could come to it, the last measure, the one who keeps the truest scale when the great have lost it. They call me that still, the ivory line in the formal record of their house, where it is written beside the daughter's name that she was lost, and judged, and condemned, and kept, and that the keeper asked for nothing and was given the one thing his kind cannot give themselves, which is to be remembered by a people who outlive empires. They asked me, the searcher asked gently in the days after, when he had taught me enough of his speech for asking, whether I would come with them, whether I would take the place that was mine now in the house of the ivory blood, the high place, the warm one, where I would never want for wood or oil or company again, and where the daughter I had kept would grow into the great rare creature she was born to be with her keeper beside her. I thought about it. I will not pretend I did not. I am old, and the winters are long, and a warm place at the end of a hard life is no small offer. But I looked around my green ruin, at the bar of sun crossing the broken floor, at the fig in the altar, and the bells on their ropes and the worn scent paths laid down in the dark, at the marsh hound asleep in my boots, and the brood of wing-cats in the rafters and the blind old pack beast who knew my step, at all the no-good throwaway things that had come up my hill to die and stayed to live, and I knew that I could not go, because they would not understand a thing I could never make them understand. That the keeping is not a thing you finish. There is always another sack left inside the broken doors before morning. There is always another dying thing that the world has measured and found worth nothing. And if I went to the warm high place and let the green ruin go cold, then the truest scale they thanked me for keeping would be the very thing I had stopped keeping, and the thanks would turn to a lie in my mouth. So I told the searcher no, and I asked him to tell the matriarch no, and to say it gently, and to say also that I was not refusing the honor but keeping it the only way I knew how, by staying where the keeping was. And he was quiet a long while, and then he made a low sound I had come to know. The sound that was the nearest his grave high kind came to a thing like grief and a thing like respect both at once. And he said the matriarch had told him I would say that, and had told him to tell me, when I did, that it was the answer of the last measure and the proof of the name, and that the daughter would stay with me as long as I lived if I would have her, and visit the house of her blood on her own great wings when they came to her at last, and be, in the end, of two houses, the high one of the ivory line and the low one of the green ruin, and that the low one would not be the lesser of the two in the reckoning of her people, not any more, not after this. They stayed 3 days that first time, the grave white company, and in those 3 days the searcher and I began the slow business of finding a speech between us. It is no easy thing to make words across two kinds, and we never came to much, but we came to enough. He would lower that great pale head to my level the way the matriarch had, patient past anything I had a right to ask of so high a creature, and he would make a sound and touch a thing, the fire, the doorstone, the bells on their ropes, the worn mint streak along the safe floor until I had the meaning, and I would say the human word back, and he would make the sound that meant he had it. He wanted to understand the world I had built her in the dark. He went over every bell, every scent path, the padded pillars, the cleared floor, the cellar drop marked off in tar, and when he had the whole of it, when he understood that a man with nothing had spent a whole winter laying down a world a blind child could run through without fear, he was quiet a long while, and then he made the low sound that was the nearest his kind came to grief and respect at once, and he told me, slow, that his people, for all their greatness, had never once thought to do such a thing for the blind ones of their own blood, but had only carried them and pitied them and decided for them what they could not do. And I told him about the wings then. I told him I had let her beat them against the winters and never bound them down, that the dignity of a living thing is in the reach and not the having, and he was quieter still. And the next morning, in the thaw light under the broken dome, the whole company watched the lost daughter of their line spread her wrong-shaped soft wings and beat them at the rising air and not lift, and not one of them looked away or looked sorry, and I understood the searcher had told them, and that they were learning it from me. The oldest law of their own blood in a ruin, from a man who could not even fly. They went down the hill in the full light of the thaw, the grave white company, and the town went on its knees again as they passed, and did not laugh any more and has not laughed since. Though I notice they tell the story now as if they had always known, as if they had not driven the wagon and marked the book and called it feeding a corpse. And I let them, because a man does not get far in this life by keeping the town's account straight, and because the only account that matters is kept in a house that outlives empires, where it is written true. Wisp stayed. She is no wisp now. She has come into the deep chest and the long grave neck of her kind, white going faint gold at the crown the way the matriarch's was, and her wings, her soft small wings that I let her beat against the winters and never bound down, her wings filled out late and wrong-shaped and strong, and she will never be the flyer her cousins are, but she flies. Low and labored, and only in the bright part of the day when the rising air off the green hill will help her, but she flies. And the first time she lifted off the broken floor and made one slow circle under the cracked dome with the sun coming through and laid herself back down beside me, breathing hard and proud, I had to sit on the altar stone again and put my hand over my mouth. And this time she heard me do it, because she hears everything, and she pushed her great pale head into my chest the way she did when she was small enough to carry, and made the steady sound, the one that is not a question. She is blind still. That does not mend, and I would not have it pitied, because she has never once needed her eyes to find the things worth finding. She knows my step on the stone before I know I have taken it. She knows the bells and the scent paths and the warm angle by the altar where the south light pools, and she knows the sound her own great kind make coming up the hill in the thaw, when they come, which is twice a year now, grave and white and gentle, to sit a day in my green ruin and speak with the daughter of their blood and bow their heads to the doorstone before they go. She knows my voice across the dark hall. And on the nights I am tired, and my knee is bad, and the wood is low, she lays her great head in my lap by the fire the way she did when she was a runt the world had thrown away, and I stroke the fine warm scale between her blind eyes, and now and again, low and careful, she asks me again the old question, the one she built up the courage for that first deep winter, am I worth the keeping, not because she doubts it now, but because she likes, I think, to hear the answer. The way an old man likes to hear a thing he is sure of said once more in the dark. And I tell her yes, I tell her every time. I am an old man, and I have kept dying things for more than 30 years in a ruin the town calls the heap, and I have buried most of them, and I have asked for nothing, and I have been given a name by a people who outlive empires, and I will tell you the plain truth of all of it, which is the only thing I ever learned worth the telling. That the world will measure you and find you wanting, your color and your eyes and your small wrong wings, and the world will be wrong, and the only measure that holds in the end is whether, when you were thrown away on a cold doorstone, somebody crouched down and held out a low hand into the dark, and waited and called you worth the keeping and meant it. I crouch down. I hold out the low hand. I wait. There is always another one coming up the hill, and in the morning when the bar of sun comes down through the crack in the old dome and crosses the green floor and warms the white head asleep in the straw, I take up my bucket, and I go and see who the night has left inside my broken doors, and I begin again.